welcome back. I'm excited to be starting this final panel so that I can go home and get some rest soon after this. Thank you all for agreeing to be a part of this final panel. You don't quite know what questions I'm going to ask, and so I'm impressed by your willingness to do this at this late hour. So let's get started by... I actually want to start by addressing some of the issues that Larry raised in his discussion. We don't always discuss what the discussant has raised, but I think some of the points that you raised were really very important. One, that the $15 an hour wage is actually too low for many, if not most, and also we should kind of give up or move away from this job loss discourse. You suggested some ways that we could, some other kinds of questions we could ask. I think I want the other panelists to address the 2 points that you raised, which I think didn't get picked up very much at all. So you can start any way you want. Laura, you have the mic, so if you're ready to go, take it.
I actually like the point a lot, and I was at CEA for a year and a half, and I remember once suggesting that, or asking why is it that we're not allowed to say that, a couple jobs lost may not be the worst thing in the world, and I was immediately shut down. And it's, because it's a little bit of we always talk about jobs, right? So, and jobs are good, but in particular, I've always thought about this case of, people holding more than one minimum wage job. It's surely if your wage doubles and you're working half the amount of time, even if you're not on the backward bending part of your supply curve, so that you're actually wanting to work less, it's not as bad as losing your job. So I think that it's certainly worth thinking about doing more research that focuses explicitly on this, looking at the probability of working more than one job rather than just the probability of working at all, or the probability of doing gig work and that sort of thing. I think it would be nice to make that an explicit focus of some of the research.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I appreciate the fact that Larry has been making this point loudly and repeatedly to the progressive community for the last couple of years. The first time that I heard him speak poignantly about that, I thought, whew, somebody is finally saying this. Minimum wage research shouldn't be held to a different standard than everything else, which, as you point out, it is. One job lost, the world falls apart. As Laura was just saying, I do think that employment loss, job loss in particular, just that 3 and 4 letter word juxtaposition is so terrifying and has been used as a scare tactic. We've got to really expand that so that people understand, and maybe it's in the wonky terms actually help, that it could be hours, it could be longer spells of unemployment, a day or 2 on average, looking for another job. That's something that everybody can relate to. Working 38 hours in a week instead of 40 or 48 instead of 50, and bringing home more income. So I think there's more research to be done there, but even more so, there's just more messaging to be done there. And so we should be thoughtful about that as a community while we're doing this research.
So I think that we should also worry less about job losses, because I think we should also worry less about jobs. In the long run, I actually think we should really sort of think about policies much more broadly. I mean, there should be, and there should have been, and there should be in the future, much more of a productivity dividend from having a thriving capitalist economy, and that should entail people working less. And I think we would be doing that, I think, if the institutional structures were in place. So I think going forward in thinking about policies as well as research, I take the view that we should be actively discussing UBI, having capital gains, wealth tax, a sovereign wealth fund, UBI. All of those are a great thing to think about in the longer run. But I think, frankly, at the same time, in the shorter run, or even in the medium run, that seems hard because I don't think we have the social structure necessarily in place. So what that gets me to is sort of in the medium run, also thinking less worried about minimum wage employment loss, is to think about direct employment. of people. We heard about this, a federal jobs guarantee, for instance, of some sort, or at least at the minimum, a much more robust employment at, say, $15 an hour, does a lot of different things. It helps build wage standards in a way where you're not held hostage to what low-wage private employers may do in response to a minimum wage increase. So in that sense, it's actually an insurance policy of sort when you're trying to experiment with higher minimum wages. I personally take the view that I think there could very well be job losses from a high enough minimum wage, including ones that are a $15 federal minimum wage. I don't know. I personally am more unsure in some cases. At the same time, if there's a backstop, for example, with a federal jobs program, the main risk there is that you will increase the public sector component of low-wage employment. I don't think most people would be terrified about that possibility as compared to not having a job. So those are some things to think about, but I think there's also a lot of practical questions about how to implement a serious federal jobs program. I mean, Robert Rubin wrote a New York Times op-ed a few weeks ago advocating for something. I know Center for American Progress has put some things out going along those lines. So I think this is definitely something that the sort of the center left is coming around to at least part of, but I think there's some real practical questions. For example, cyclicality versus structural nature of the jobs and the job deficits are across different places. How do you deal with that? How do you sort of think about how much of a federal jobs program would actually crowd out private jobs versus recruit from unemployed workforce? There are a lot of questions, and these are a lot of research questions, I think, that in terms of CWED and thinking about how this actually is very complementary to building a wage floor, to building a higher wage floor, and especially experimenting with higher wage floor. So those are some things that I would just sort of throw out, both as research as well as policy priorities going forward.
Yeah, so on the issue of job loss, I think, yes, so we have anecdotal examples of overworked low-income Americans, taking two jobs. So I think those are great, as an advocacy piece to show that with a higher minimum wage, you no longer need to. But what we need, I think, is research, showing whether, this effect is visible. And in principle, with CPS data, you do have information, on jobs. So with the type of data, analysis you're looking at, do you see, the very long hours at the bottom being cut, when there is a minimum wage increase? I think that'd be a wonderful research project.
Well, may I just add that one of my points was we shouldn't have one job loss as a litmus test, but also that all of the research that deals with employment loss is misstating the actual dynamics. And what we need is a call for research on what happens to the change in the distribution of annual hours worked in response to a minimum wage, so that we can better understand the dynamics at play.
So Aaron ended up touching on a number of points that I wanted you all to address, and I'm not quite sure if I want to praise you or punish you for that, Aaron. I'm going to praise you and still ask the questions so that others can respond to it. So we're thinking in terms of ways of improving the health and well-being of American families, and clearly we're looking at the role that the increasing minimum wage can play, but there are all other policy alternatives. So there is the UBI, there is expanding the EITC even further. There are some other the federal job guarantees. Are we focusing so much attention on the minimum wage that we're not paying attention to how some of these other interventions might be as helpful, if not more helpful, in some of the outcomes that we care about? How do we adjudicate between these different approaches that could possibly improve the health and well-being of families?
I'm holding this. Can I go? I want to start with something that Ken said about what started CTAC, which was the contracting out of a good, basically machinist union job and becoming a low-wage job. And, most of the things that we're talking about are only dealing with the bottom 30%. And I think one of the questions is, how do we have more people who could have had that kind of job that was a good machinist union job, dealing with baggage and all that stuff. And we're not dealing with that. So I want to put in a plug for that. We have to think broader than that. And obviously, not obviously, but in my, I think we have to rebuild a collective bargaining system somehow in this country. I think we have a lot of work to do to think through both what that would look like and how to get there. But I don't think we're going to get to the kind of democracy we want or the economy we want without it. And I'll just say one thing about the UBI. I guess I'm not for it. And I think it's a misguided direction. Because I think it doesn't fit with some basic values in America. We already have a safety net which became more work-oriented by trashing TANF. We now have a great momentum of the Republican Congress this next year to put work requirements on SNAP and Medicaid. So it's a really big lift to think that we're going to provide incomes independent of work. And I also think the amount of money involved, it ends up being not that much money. And it really doesn't deal, the amount of money you get on UBI is really pretty minimal. So I understand a lot of the sentiment for it, but it just doesn't appeal to me.
Do you know about specific policies that I don't know, or prescriptions that I don't know about? Because I don't.
The UBI?
Yeah, I mean.
They're out there. They're out there,
and they range considerably. So I'm wondering what you're thinking about, because you seem to be identifying ones that appear relatively weak to you, but others would argue that there are different ways that you can do it for different people, so that it can help to solve some problems. It certainly wouldn't be
maybe I need to familiarize myself with more. But the fact that it's universal basic income, meaning you're going to give it to everybody, and if it's going to be at a high level, it's going to take an enormous amount of revenue. I haven't seen one. The kind of levels I've seen referred to are modest. So $15,000 a person or something like that. That's not. The median household income is, I don't know. I just don't think it's going to do it. But I don't want to hog the mic.
Yeah. On this one, I tend to agree with Larry. Actually, I think we have a huge inequality problem in America, and we have a problem of inequality in pre-tax, in how pre-tax, labor income and capital income is distributed, and I don't think we can solve it purely, by transfers, EITC, universal basic income. What the public wants is really better pre-tax labor income that is good paying jobs. So the minimum wage helps you at the bottom, but it's a very blunt tool. The federal minimum wage is totally uniform across states. A state minimum wage is uniform across industries. And so the next step of what we need is exactly that is give power to workers to negotiate, better wages, through collective agreement. I mean, there's a lot of evidence from many countries, especially in Europe, that this is really the driving force, for having good wages throughout the distribution. And I'm surprised, that union policy is not emphasized more, because it seems to me like it would resonate, with this populist moment. Let's not have the government, give us handouts, but let's force companies, to pay better through a negotiation. But I agree that it's a very heavy lift, but I think it's high time to think about it and change the current model where you unionize, at one firm at a time. That doesn't work. You really need to go, industry by industry, sectoral bargaining.
Well, I knew UBI would not be popular in this room, so I figured I should say it. And I used it as kind of a bit of a foil. I actually do believe in the long run we should decenter. I think having the notion of deservedness be tied to work is not a great normative thing to strive for. At the same time, that is what completely agree. That's in a positive sense. That's what the world looks like, and that's why pre-tax earnings matter. I think it's very hard for me to see a substantial increase in collective bargaining in the United States, even if with much more friendly much more friendly union organizing rules. So I think there has to be other ways of targeting the wage distribution, and this is where I think public employment can play an important role. I do think also types of wage bargaining regimes or wage setting regimes, including sectoral and wage boards, which may actually have sector-specific minimum wages, which some states have wage boards, and those could be expanded. And I think having other ways, so essentially you have extension of agreement through the industry, which is the way wage setting is done in many European countries, but those seem more plausible rather than getting up union density, because that seems very, unfortunately, hard to imagine. But I think what I want to bring back to is the notion that when we think of public sector employment, one rubric of thinking about it is competition. It's a pro-competitive policy, and there's a lot of interest and recognition, research, that there's increasing concentration of economic power thanks to work much more than anyone else, Emmanuel and Thomas Piketty. And so I think that has taken many forms, and there's increasing recognition of increasing monopoly power. There's also, I think, increasing concentration in the labor market. There's a very interesting paper by Ioana Marinescu and co-authors that show how wages respond to concentration in the labor market. And I think where I see the federal government coming in and actually intervening in the labor market to actually increase competition in the labor market is a frame that I have. And I think thinking more about what are some practical ways of doing that, how do you target different parts of the distribution, that seems like a really rich both research and policy agenda.
So I think it's gratifying to hear someone who's a nationally renowned scholar in minimum wage issues championing on our little panel here federal job guarantee. So back to your original question of, are we overlooking things because we've been so focused on the minimum wage? I actually, reflecting on this a couple of weeks ago, tried to think to myself, and I'm dating myself in the wrong direction here, but tried to think, where have I heard these three ideas that have now come up over and over and over this past year again? A livable minimum wage, a universal basic income, which was really not spoken about, at least in the circles that I run in, until the last few years, and a federal job guarantee together. And it was in history books that I had on the civil rights movement, the March on Washington, Dr. Martin Luther King. They were talking about these things 50 years ago and putting them all together. And whether folks today realize that or not, we're kind of coming back to the roots in some way of a very progressive movement by putting all of that together. And so I appreciate Erin's point that all of these three ideas can interact in ways that we haven't fully thought through. For example, a federal job guarantee or even a big public jobs program would effectively be insurance for folks who are at the bottom of the labor market and are maybe disadvantaged in terms of hours or even in terms of jobs and employment by an increase in the minimum wage. It would mean a massive expansion of the public sector, but maybe this is the time to be talking about that. And if we shoot for the moon, I think, and get these things on in the mindset and on the table, then maybe what we end up with is not a full job guarantee, which goodness knows is highly uncertain and very expensive, of course, but maybe we end up with a big public jobs program or a great federally subsidized jobs program, which, as Jared pointed out earlier, we've done in the last few years. Maybe we don't end up with a $15 federal minimum wage, but we end up with a $12 one that's indexed. And maybe we don't end up with a UBI, but we end up with but by restoring something like TANF, or we end up with periodic transfers to families with children, like my organization has suggested for the child tax credit. So there are smaller things that we can do to achieve these big goals in incrementalism, I think.
Okay, so I think that one reason why it is important to keep the focus on the minimum wage, and probably maybe this is sort of a circular argument, but the reason why we do is because it's so popular and because it's easy to understand, and all you have to do to get it is to have a job, and it's relatively well enforced, I mean, not completely, but an issue at the same time I would say. So what I'm going to say is the issue with transfer programs is, take-up rates, and people that also could be partly an information problem, but partly just the ethic, in this country, and the sort of the idea that there's a stigma still attached to taking benefits. Like SNAP take-up is lower among older people. So some of this is changing. There are things that we could do to promote competition in the labor market, but also a lot of that is about information. And so for an example here is many workers sign non-compete agreements with their employers, making it difficult for them to leave and arguably making the labor market much, much less competitive. I mean, I think this is an important area for future research, in fact, but surveys show that employees sign these agreements, even in California, where they're not enforced, and they don't know about them, but everyone knows what the minimum wage is. So I guess that's, it's sort of one thing. I guess we should have a sort of two-pronged approach. Continue working on the minimum wage because it's popular among workers and because it's a relatively easy thing, but also, with other programs, they're complicated. They need to be, I guess, better explained, better promoted, and maybe more automated enrollment would help. The same as you can think of a million examples. The same is true with. Student loan, income-driven repayment plans, and forgiveness plans for student loans. All these things that can help low-wage workers and help students get education are basically information problems to start with.
Michael, I wanted to ask one more question before I open it up. But I did want to say one thing before I moved on to the next question. What's expensive? The criminal justice system, and we seem to be more than happy to invest in that over a few decades. So I'm not sure that the reason why we would say we can't do this is because it's too expensive, because we clearly make those kinds of decisions all the time. So just throwing that out there. So in terms of CWED moving forward, next 3 to 5 years, next 10 years. Let's imagine ourselves here again in 10 years. The room will be painted, floors will be redone. What kinds of questions, research questions, do you think CWED scholars should be addressing over the next 3 to 5 years or so that they currently aren't talking about how to raise low pay? What would you recommend that the scholars focus on? And since you actually touched on the question.
Okay, well, so one is non-compete agreements. So there are new data sets being collected. For example, payscale.com is now asking people to report when they've signed non-compete agreements. And I think as there's more awareness about practices like this, there's a dual benefit. One, workers become more aware, and two, we have more data, and we can study these things. And I think California is an interesting example where states are starting to consider laws to enforce the way these contracts work and the way they are, arbitrated. What workers can do to defend themselves. And I think potentially going forward, we'll see more on that front. What else can we do? What else? You mentioned criminal justice. So many states have tried to deal with the issue of a third of the adult population in the U.S. having a criminal record and reentry rates being very low by addressing two important issues. One is the use of criminal background checks, which is ubiquitous, and ban-the-box laws have been adopted to the idea behind them being that employers should not be screening on criminal records before actually considering an applicant. And another is licensing laws that make it impossible for people with criminal records to get a license, to do many occupations that have, even it's sort of irregardless of how long ago the record was, regardless of whether the offense has anything to do with the job. And there's been, up until 2 years ago, there were the theoretical, economists would say, well, ban the box laws, there's a risk there, because if employers are screening on criminal backgrounds, then maybe by the time they get to the interview, they really aren't going to hire people with criminal backgrounds if that's what they really care about. And the other risk is that criminal backgrounds are correlated with other things that we care about, like race. And the risk is that if employers still discriminate on race, which it turns out they do, that they might fall back on discriminating against race. And there are a couple new papers that have shown that indeed this policy, because there's been now some state-level variation, has led to increased discrimination on race. This is something that potentially licensing reform doesn't have the same problem, because licensing, just removing blanket licensing restrictions for people with criminal backgrounds, it just allows people to apply for the jobs and have the jobs. It's not about employer screening. And I think states have started to pass laws to remove these blanket restrictions, and that's an area where I think there should be more research. And it will be not feasible in the future. So I guess one other thing, just to reiterate what Aaron said, and he can probably talk about it more, is that we need more research on just documenting the competitiveness of the labor market and the likely decline in labor market competition over the past couple of decades. And this also goes to the point Emmanuel made earlier, is that we need to stop thinking about the competitive model as sort of the default, and showing that maybe that's really not the appropriate default model for the labor market.
Just very quickly on the criminal justice front, I absolutely agree, both on the fiscal impact of it and the incredible detriment that it's had to our society. I think it's evident to everyone in this room, and that we should be doing as much as we can in terms of labor research to lift up solutions that work there. One that I'm hopeful more states will adopt, that CAP has done some work in pushing, especially in Pennsylvania and in several other states, is actually going even further than ban the box, is automatic expungements that are free of cost for certain types of records after a specified amount of time. It's called clean slate legislation. It's moving quickly in Pennsylvania. Hopefully other states will be adopters as well. And so licensing reform, certainly important. Ban the box, I think, is a great first step, but criminal justice advocates generally see something like clean slate as a goal at the end of that road as well. In terms of things that I think I would love to see CWED pursue, obviously, based on the panel that I was on, I think downstream impacts of minimum wages, particularly on children, are very important and understudied, and not just sort of immediate impacts, but longer term ones, using the framework of the sort of two-generation model that has entered the sort of public consciousness in the last couple of decades. On it's not just parents, it's also children, and it's long-term effects as well as short-run ones. So I'm encouraged to see that you have a lot of research in the works there. One thing that I'm interested in, and I'm not certain that I could fully build out a research plan for this yet, but is in addition to earnings, I think that earnings stability and volatility are actually incredibly important for low-wage workers. Pew and Aspen have been doing a lot of work lately on income fluctuations and income volatility. The U.S. Financial Diaries, some folks may have heard of, it ended up being a rather small study because it's expensive to do, but tracking literally every several hundred families, every single transaction, and taking in the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month income fluctuations and fluctuations in other resources as well. I would love to see evidence on how minimum wage changes affect families' stability in terms of their pocketbook. A flip side of that, that is also an outcome, is family stability of the type that Lindsay referenced in her presentation, sort of family structure and stability and strength that you can get at through the Fragile Families Survey, for example. I would love to see the kind of research on stability that we've seen on income and earnings.
Yeah, so just echoing some of the other things that were already said, I think so complementary with thinking about building standards in the low-wage labor market are also thinking about the structure of the labor market. And I think here, especially increasing, the gig economy and other types of non-standard work, getting a handle on the sort of the structure of bargaining, the power, whatever you will, and wage setting in these contexts is quite important. With a number of other people, we've been running experiments in these online labor market platforms, and it turns out these are extremely monopsonistic, meaning the employers have a lot of wage setting power. This is experimental evidence, so monopsony exists. Look around, do some experiments, you can usually find that out. And I think that's really relevant for gig economy, because these are places, essentially workers are not super, their labor supply is not very elastic to some of these gig type settings. At least in some of these platforms. And that makes it potentially very problematic, as wages can go very low. So understanding, I think, that component is useful. But then thinking in terms of what job quality means, there's other attributes, I think, in thinking about sort of quality jobs. There sort of economists generally talk about amenities. So there's wages, and then there's other amenities, and presumably, what are these amenities? I mean, one of them is sort of scheduling, predictability, right? And so, especially in the low-wage labor market, those are some things. Getting a better handle on some of these other attributes of job quality, how they may respond, including to like high-pressure labor markets or to policies. I think it seems like a good, important research, part of a research agenda in thinking about building, sort of job quality standards.
Yeah. So I think yes, the challenge is really to understand how wages are formed, how output, value added is distributed between workers, across workers, and businesses. And I think, the key to make progress on those questions is to get good data. And there really has been a data revolution, so that we can say over the last 25 years, we've made tremendous progress. We've seen it in the minimum wage. We saw the presentation by Arin, how, each new layer of better data allowed researchers to do better. And my sense is that pretty soon it will be standard to match employees to firms to really address those issues well with administrative data covering, the full population, so you can really drill in on small things. I mean, small regulations that you wouldn't be able to study, with the CPS, but that with big data you're able to do. We see graduate students, currently doing these things, sometimes, in other countries, and teaching us a lot. So my prediction is that once we have, those great administrative data, it will be a revival of industrial relations, because we will be really able to test and apply, the modern labor standards of identifying things in a much richer way. And I think CWED should play a key role in this.
All right. So I'm going to surprise people and suggest something that's not empirical. So I think one of the things that we're lacking as policy-oriented researchers and policy advocates is a framework for how to think about labor standards. And it comes up all the time when confronted with minimum wage proposals that want to differentiate by geography, by firm size, by who's got disabilities, by age. We have one proposal. Arin has a proposal that says to set it as a percent of the median hourly wage, which is a legitimate idea. What I think that kind of idea, what's missing for me is how do we get convergence? How do we get the bottom to move up? Because if you have a bottom level median wage, it's basically accommodates that rather than, forcing the wage structure up. And one of the areas where that's really, and this has always been an issue, with the South setting federal labor standards. And I think we know that given, unless we have strong federal labor standards that actually have some more bite in the South, that the South will be a low-wage equilibrium, built to basically oppress black workers. And if we don't do something about that, it won't change. My last comment, there is a lot of discussion about monopoly these days and monopsony, and they tend to be easily, I'm not saying anyone here has done that, but they tend to be equated. And I want to suggest that is a too narrow thinking, because in my view, the labor market does operate as if there is a global monopsony of the employer class. And it's not about having a few employers per labor market or product market. It's about the fact that employer practices such as non-competes or forced arbitration agreements start spreading across everyone. So we've done a survey that showed that 56% of employers now have forced arbitration agreements. That has nothing to do with the number of employers, monopsony per se, or monopoly. They are setting the standards in a way that limits the options of all workers. And I think that's a way to think about it rather than, I think economists like to think about monopoly and monopsony because we have models for that. And economists don't think in, frankly, class terms. But I would like to suggest the latter.
So let's open it up for questions now. Michael, you had
my question or my comment really was about the, the UBI, which I'm opposed to for a variety of reasons. But it seems to me, from an analytical point of view, a labor economist, that it's going to operate as a wage subsidy for employers, and it's just because if you're getting $8,000 through the UBI, you're not going to need as much. Your reservation wage will go down. Not up, but down, and so I'm not sure there's really. I think it's really important to look at those interactions. That's all.
See what you write with
that. I have just two quick points, and then one other point. Larry, labor standards, I just would like you to articulate which ones you're thinking of, just to be more, but, you want to do that now?
Well, obviously it's a minimum wage, but we had the recent example of the overtime threshold, where the administration was going to set it at a certain level, and then it backed down to set it was going to set it at the 40th percentile of the wage distribution for salaried workers nationally, and then it backed off to set it at the 40th percentile of the southern wage distribution for salaried workers, because in responding to employers in the South saying, we can't do it, So the question is, what's our framework for saying that is a wrong decision? If we think that's wrong, my intuition, that's wrong. So, how do we think about what we're doing with labor standards that explains why we choose one versus another? Then there's always going to be trade-offs, right? Because there's always issues of, if you set it at a certain high level, at some point, being economists, we think that may have an adverse consequence at some level. So that's what I'm thinking.
And then I just wonder what the panel thinks. I have a feeling this might not be that popular, but I think one thing I got from today, I think we really know how to raise the pay of low-wage workers, but it's harder for middle-wage workers. What about an EITC that was kind of like modeled almost after the Fight for 15 in the sense that it really went way beyond what we're doing now? What are we spending, 60 or 70 billion a year on the EITC? Imagine spending twice that and structuring it so that even if your income was, or if your earnings were around the median, you still got it so that the phase out was much longer. I know it's very redistributive, but I just wondered what you thought about that. And then third, so today, and Rachel and I, others, Larry in DC, you know, today was unusual because we're talking about facts all day, and where we live, that's really not the currency of the realm. And so CWED can do all sorts of great stuff, but if we can't figure out how to get back to Factville, we're going to be stranded wherever we are. Now, I don't think it's the role of CWED to figure that out, but I guess I'm just putting out an idea that people like us need to work perhaps with others who can help solve that part of the equation.
If I can just respond to there's a bill for that EITC, Jared, which, yeah, for folks who didn't see, I think it was Ro Kahana and Senator Brown introduced a bill that is, I think, largely a message bill to say, hey, if Trump's going to spend $1.4 trillion on tax cuts for the rich and corporations, well, we can do that through the EITC, which I think personally is a favorable trade-off. But I think my concerns about that, and probably a lot of folks' concerns about a massively boosted EITC are twofold. First of all, that the same as Michael's concern about UBI, that Emmanuel and Jesse's research shows how much leaks through to employers. And my sense of the direction of that effect is that the further up you push the EITC away from the minimum wage, the greater share, maybe even, is going to leak through to employers and effectively create a subsidy. And then secondly, of course, as a person who works on poverty, I think I would feel remiss if I didn't point out that, like, there are a lot of people in this country who can't work, whether they have a disability, they're children, they're elderly, and so pinning that much of our social resources on to work seems to me like a misguided use of resources and priorities. Yeah.
Yeah. So on the EITC, I think it'd be better to cut payroll taxes, at the bottom, so that the first 15K, of payroll taxes, the first 15K would be exempt, from payroll taxes. I think it'd be a cleaner way, to make the overall tax transfer system more progressive. Now, the EITC is currently linked to kids. That is, you get it, if you are a family with kids and you work. So essentially, it's a subsidy for working, when you have kids. So you can see it almost as a daycare cash, subsidy, that is. And I think it's a very inefficient way of structuring things. I think, the experience from many countries is that to take care of kids, while working, it's much better to have the government do it, systematically. It's much more efficient and less costly for society. So I don't think we should go further in that direction.
Three more questions, and we're done. So it's Joe, then Carl, and then Bill.
Yeah, many things to say, but I'll try and limit myself. One question I have regarding the minimum wage that I don't think anybody spoke to directly, although I may have missed it. The percentage of the workforce affected by the minimum wage, in other words, classified as employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act, is shrinking. Is that not correct? I don't believe it's not. Okay. Because there's been a lot of publicity in the growth of the sectors of the workforce that are not covered by, the gig employment, misclassified workers, et cetera. So if that's not true, then forget that. But I am wondering if the increase in minimum wage might have, or if anybody's ever looked at this, might have an impact on pushing employers to misclassify more workers. Now, we know that the ACA had an impact on pushing part-time workers down below the 30-hour threshold, so that employers in at least some employment sectors, so that they didn't have to be impacted by the mandate and instead go to the exchanges individually. So I wonder about that, and I also wonder. I'm a little disappointed that it was 4 o'clock before anybody said the word union, except for one comment from the back in this whole day. And I just think that people might, reflect on that and on the character of the discussion and where we're sitting and why we're sitting here. And finally, I was really impressed by a different aspect of what Larry said earlier in his comment from the floor. The aspect of it of reframing the rhetoric around some of this discussion. I think we need to really think about that. And I have another suggestion about reframing the rhetoric that I'd love to hear people's reaction to. A number of presentations, I only started writing them down after the third or fourth one. Okay, all right. People refer to big increases in the minimum wage. Major. I don't think that we should be ever saying that. We should be saying that the decline in the purchasing power of the minimum wage has in some cases been slowed or halted. I think we should be looking at it from that end. I'm talking about the long-term trend, looking at it from the late 60s as that chart is, the long-term decline.
So let's take the questions from Carl and Bill, and then we can address those.
Sorry.
And no need to apologize, and then we can wrap it up.
I was just wanting to dig in a little bit more about some of the ideas you guys were talking about were like wage boards and different kinds of bargaining arrangements, and there's a lot of different alternatives and possibilities there, and there isn't a lot of new research about which way we go. And I was just wondering if one of the issues I wonder about is sometimes labor research is so focused these days on kind of very broad general analyses, and sometimes I wonder if we need to get more to kind of answer those kinds of questions. I wonder if people feel like a good direction to go is to get more kind of narrow, do more case studies. In industrial organization, they've made a lot of progress sometimes of understanding specific markets by, like looking at healthcare, for instance. I wonder if labor economics sometimes should become a little bit more focused on specific kind of occupational groups or certain kinds of sectors, if we really want to start thinking about wage boards at the sector level or something.
I just want to put in my 2 cents on 2 things. One, on Larry's point, please remember the reason why we have a black wealth gap is because we design progressive policies to excuse the South. The majority of black workers still live in the South. Therefore, the majority of black workers, and only black workers, still live in states where the minimum wage is the federal minimum wage. They don't have a minimum wage increase. So let's be clear, every time you give into the South, you recreate all the conditions that created the current wealth gap. Every time we do this. So we have to rethink that seriously. Because then laws don't work equally. And white workers will see laws work for them, and they'll look at black workers and don't understand, why didn't it work for you? I actually like the UBI far better than the job guarantee. No one has given to me an adequate answer to the very complicated issues that come up because of labor market discrimination. And you dance around it. I mean, even on the ban the box. This is really because black advocates couldn't argue for ending discrimination in hiring. This is a way we know they're trying to screen us and discriminate against us. Please help us. But they really should have said, stop discriminating against us on race. And as Diva Pager's work has shown, that's what they were really doing, because they don't care if a white guy has a criminal record. That's irrelevant. Just like this month, the unemployment rate for white high school dropouts was lower than the unemployment rate for blacks with an associate's degree. So, and that's why the job guarantee is very difficult to put your hands around, because of that gap, the unemployed black population is highly educated. So telling us that you're going to give us high school jobs or high school dropout jobs is not very helpful. It's far more complicated. And what we learned from the downturn, delivering income is very complicated. Our system isn't designed for it. If you finished college during the downturn, you weren't eligible for unemployment insurance. If you lost 8 weeks, if you lost 10 days of employment because of the floods in Houston, you can't get unemployment insurance for 10 days of unemployment. There are all sorts of complications in the way our systems work, and UBI, I think, is a better way to do it. Anyway, what I'd like CWED to do is, we now have so many states turning right to work that we have a far better chance to look at what are the real impacts of unionization, and what does it mean, and what does it mean to be in a state. Now, before they go right to work, they have already had a decline in union density. So it's not that right to work causes the decline, but right to work accelerates the decline. So there are all sorts of experiments that CWD could do with this better data that you have now to finally give us the real answer on why we need unions. And I think we haven't had an opportunity like this before, and I hope that CWD includes that. And this is what we need to do, because now we have a far better way of looking at the impact of unionization, including on workers who aren't in unions.
Okay, there you go. Take it away. First, do you want to correct some misconceptions?
Larry, did you want to talk about W-2s?
Well, I'll just, yeah, there's a lot of discussion about the nature of work changing. And there's been good work done here in this ILRE and about that. So, but even even when people point to something that shows an expansion of alternative work arrangements, I'll just take the last Katz and Kruger estimate, which shows that alternative work arrangements have risen to 15% of the workforce from 10% in 2005. So that's a big change in a category, but it's 15%. And the self-employment rate within that is 9% of all workers. And I've done work that shows that self-employment is the same rate now as it was in 1995. So there's really but there's an interesting question to all this gig work stuff. And I've looked at all of the data around gig work. And the fact is that most gig work is an extra job. And so you really have to ask, why is it that so many people are taking extra jobs to earn extra income? And partly they're able to because technology is enabling it, and partly because they need to. And but they and this the last thing I'll say about this is, gig work represents something like 0.1% of all wages. 0.1%, and because and a lot of that is actually misclassification. I mean, Uber is a giant bully, period.
Just one quick point. Annetta Bernhardt suggested a couple of days or weeks ago that much of the gig work that she associates with the extra employment, these are people who otherwise would have just been doing informal under the table jobs, and so now they have a gig economy that they can be a part of, and so she thinks it's likely that there's this kind of shift, that people who otherwise would have done that kind of work are now taking on this kind of platform.
So I'll speak to one other thing about the collective bargaining thing. I do, so Aaron may have misunderstood me. I mean, I am so far from, we need something like the Employee Free Choice Act. That is a non-solution to our problem. And as the head of Labor's think tank, that's not easy to say. But, so it is sectoral bargaining, and I wish our French colleague here would, there's so much I want to know more about that, and then why it's so much under attack. why, I mean, Macron is really trying to erode that. And so, I feel like, okay, I want to do this thing, but they're turning their backs on it. Why is that? On case studies, I just, I think understanding what happens in particular situations is huge. And I remember, I'm going to say this for Bill Spriggs, when I went up to our econometrics professor in his office, a huge giant of the field, Art Goldberger, and I said, well, how come we're learning all these econometrics? You don't teach us how to do case studies. And he didn't have a good answer to that.
Yeah, no, so I mean, on case studies, I think, yes, that's the way to go. And I think when you look at what students are doing, in their PhD, they tend to be case studies where you can learn very sharply, something specific, but that has broader applicability.
Yeah, let me just say, I think case studies are always very useful, and I think if we try to understand, heterogeneities of various different labor market segments, that's of course very, very, very useful. I think the CWED should do more of that. But I want to point out, this was being done. I mean, in the 80s, 90s. I mean, there's a whole literature on high-performing work systems. It's sector-wide studies that were done, and it just makes me. I was just thinking about this recently because this was coming up in a conversation, and it's like, what have we sort of learned about particular cases in the 80s and 90s when wage standards were falling so much? Because it seems like a lot of work, including people in this room, did a lot of that, and it was maybe we need to revisit and think about do we understanding how wage standards, norms, whatever are created, reproduced, etc. In that doing, let me just bring back to one issue about data, since that's also Emmanuel brought it up. I think it relates to CWED and IRLE generally. I think one of the issues that's, if you look at economics literature, increasing use of administrative data is, of course, very common. At the same time, a lot of this data is really not publicly available. So one of the things to do, and in our work, one of the things we did was to use early versions of micro-aggregated administrative data, which was available publicly. That means our work could be replicated, reproduced, and it was by many people, including people not sympathetic. And that's great. That's how we make progress. And so I think what I would say is, as we push for more access to administrative data, one of the roles that I think entities like the California Policy Lab and other folks here can play is to actually make more public cuts, richer public administrative data cuts available that can help us do things like detailed case studies, or look at particular effective minimum wages on some subpopulation, which is harder to do with the current system of very opaque ways of accessing some of this richer data. So let me just stop there.
Want to say to Bill that I really appreciate your comment on and sort of push back on the idea of a job guarantee, basically pigeonholing workers who are already disadvantaged and because they're facing discrimination into jobs that are not only could be lower quality, but could be perceived by the private market as lower quality. And that's something that I think has not been thought through fully, even with respect to it doesn't even have to be a guarantee, full guarantee, but a targeted job guarantee or even a big public works program. So I appreciate that comment. My one pushback on my strongest pushback on the UBI amongst many hesitations that I have that just hasn't been voiced, so I'd like to say it, is that it's a practical concern that there are people who want to basically replace every social assistance program that we have with a lump sum of money that is not sufficient to meet people's needs, particularly people who have specific needs, like folks who are disabled, like folks who have children, or face health issues. So just pointing out that to the extent that a UBI could displace other targeted social assistance programs, I think that's really problematic territory for us to be in.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay with that. So I think that this means that you are up. You are to wrap things up, Sylvia.
So just sit there. Go ahead. This is going to be So I wanted to thank you all for coming and staying most of the day. This was a great panel, so thank you all. I think one of the things we have to think about is all the minimum wage and the different policies, EITC, UBI, whatever we're talking about, the narrative of are they replacements or complement? Are they substitutes or complements, right? And so we have to kind of keep that narrative. I loved Larry's comments earlier about something that were kind of, inadvertently playing into the employment effects of the minimum wage. But in our defense, we have been trying to push the discourse away from that, even though some of our work right now does. And as Rachel has been alluding to, we have a whole new research agenda that we're calling downstream effects. And so we've just, Anna and Carl and Michael and I, we've gotten new data, vital statistics data. A lot of the papers that Will went over when he was saying, we need to have the minimum wage experts come in and run the models a little bit better and more thoughtful. Like, we're actually going to do that. We've gotten some funding to do that. We've got the proprietary vital statistics data. We're right now, Anna's running stuff looking at minimum wage and infant health, infant birth weight, infant death, prenatal care. We're going to look at the BRFSS behavioral survey data that Will was talking about in some of those papers, and we're going to rerun some of those models with the more outcomes that he suggested, using hopefully the better methodologies that we know about. So we are hoping in the real near future to really start pushing the discourse, because these higher minimum wages, well, this has always been the case, that minimum wages have needed a much broader and more inclusive dialogue and research on cost-benefit analysis, right? That's what we're talking about, getting away from this crazy one metric of employment. That's just silly, as we all know. So that's definitely on our agenda. We're actively making our way there, and we're really excited about contributing to this research. And you've given us a great amount of research ideas here. Some of them we've actually talked about, and if we get more than 2.5 workers, we might be able to do that. But we also would love to collaborate with a lot of you folks, and I love that we have this great DC contingency here. So we should keep in touch and actually think, because we love all of our research associates, like all these people are here are. So we actually are much bigger than we seem, even though we're the little center that could, and we're going to keep on going. So I'm just going to one last time reiterate, I have to thank Sandra. This just would have never happened if she wasn't here at this point in time. Sarah Hinckley, again, Carl, Anna, of course, my partner in crime, Michael Reich, and all of our staff that was so tremendous, really. We pulled this off in a way that was kind of unbelievable. And I thank you all for coming, especially everyone who traveled. It's been a really somewhat tiring, but I think a great day, and I thank you all for coming. And now we're going to just have one more kind of refreshments back in the library. And yeah.